I'm the Dean of Milano GPIA in its old instantiation, and now it's called the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Public Policy. And I am really delighted to have you here this evening. This is a very special alumni panel, all of them from the same class, which is kind of remarkable. We were trying to figure out how that could have happened, whether it was the water or mutual influence or one member of the faculty who had a profound effect on all of them. But it does seem to me quite wonderful that we have a group of people all interested in human rights and who are going to share with you something about their own careers, how they came to be doing what they're doing, and given that human rights is such a crucial feature of the new school, and I think Milano GPIA in particular, it's especially important for us to hear about what people can do to make a difference in human rights. And I think it's even more poignant at this particular moment in world history, where so much is going on that turns on issues associated with human rights and efforts at self-determination, changes in political systems, new forms of economic exchange. There are so many issues that touch on human rights writ large, and the kind of human rights that we're seeing violated constantly in too many revolutions, and to find ways in which individual countries can make a difference. What is the nature of the difference they should make in ensuring the human rights of others are all affecting each of us as individuals as we think about our own moral responsibility, but also affecting governments. And consequently, the kind of discussion that we'll have this evening is exquisitely important in terms of what individuals can do in working for agencies that seek to make a difference, how they can influence government in ensuring that we do what is morally right in ensuring as many people's human rights as we possibly can. So we'll hear a lot about, I hope, your careers and how your careers might influence or might have a bearing on the choices that alumni and current students will be making soon. So I'm delighted to have you here. I think you're going to be introducing everybody, but I want to just welcome you again, and it's really a special pleasure to have you here. And I'm now going to turn you over to our moderator, Professor Everita Salina, who chairs our international field program in Hong Kong, and whose research and teaching focus on genocide, global governance, and security issues. I think an appropriate moderator for a really important evening. So welcome to everybody, and a special welcome to our panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, sorry. Quite a nice room we are in. You might have noticed around the theme is not exactly distant from the topic we are talking about today. Let me start by introducing our panelists. We have four former students of International Affairs program. They all graduated, as it turns out, the same year in 2009. So starting from my right, we have Elizabeth Beresford. You can find, by the way, you can find their more detailed biographies and what they have been doing since they left school in your programs. So please consult those. Next to Elizabeth, we have Nat Katten-Borland. He also graduated in 2009. Next to Nat, we have Mark Mauski. And next to Mark, we have Sonia Uimana. So please welcome our panelists to today's discussion. Let me very briefly explain to you what is going to happen in the next couple of hours, well, in the next 2 hours. First, we'll hear from our panelists, and hopefully they will pique your interest and motivate you to ask various questions. For those purposes, we have distributed little note cards that should be on each chair. So if you're not finding one, you're probably sitting on top of it. Please use a note card to write your question that you can then pass to the front and I will ask the panelists to answer your questions, and hopefully everyone's question will be answered. If for some reason your question doesn't get answered to your satisfaction, or we run out of time, we'll give everyone about 10 minutes at the beginning, and then Q&A will follow. There will be a session afterwards, after the Q&A, where each panelist will be at the separate table, and you will be able to ask them more, perhaps intimate, probing, personal questions that you don't feel comfortable asking to the whole audience. And that will be a kind of networking, speed networking type event, and it will be about 10 minutes for each table. We'll play it by ear a little bit, and so they'll rotate, and so each one of you will be able to ask each one of our panelists the questions that didn't get answered. So I hope that makes sense, and we can all progress through this with most satisfaction to everybody here. Let me prompt your introduction by asking you to kind of give our assembled students some indication of your work trajectory, both prior to International Affairs program as well as afterwards. Tell us perhaps more about the kind of job you're doing right now, or the kind of pursuits you're engaged in, and any kind of general observations that you would make specific to today's topic involving human rights and work in human rights. So with those kind of general questions, I'll turn it over to our panelists. And again, we have about 10 minutes for each one of you, give and take, to tell us about that. So, Elizabeth, do you want to start?
So my career actually started in the film and television business. And I started out as like a production assistant right out of college, and wound up doing film and television production for about 6 or 7 years, and doing a range of projects from reality television to commercials to music videos to feature films, and ultimately found it fairly unsatisfying after several years. And toward the end of that kind of 6 or 7 year stint, I was working more on documentaries, and really felt like that was coming closer to what I wanted to do because of the social justice themes that the content that I was working with. So one of my final films that I worked on was The Garden, which was a documentary that was nominated for an Oscar. And you know, what better way to kind of leave the film business, I thought, and go to graduate school. So I only applied to the New School at that time. I was really confident that that was the program that I wanted. And I had known a couple people who'd done the program. And I knew that human rights work would be probably the focus. And I had become more interested in immigrants' rights issues with the Garden film. But it was still just, it was an opportunity for me to kind of open the door into another world. And I felt really strongly actually that I might be leaving media and communications work behind entirely, that I wanted to work really exclusively on program work and pursue a more academic approach. And so I, come into the New School, which is such a good program actually for exposing you to so many different kinds of paths, with the media. I think it's media studies concentration, which I actually did not do. I did the human rights concentration. And again, I think I was just trying to distance myself quite a bit from it. And I kept getting pulled back into it. I was curating exhibits at the UN, and I was doing internships that wound up being communications and advocacy at Amnesty International and the Women's Refugee Commission. And I just kept getting pulled back into kind of multimedia communications work. And that wound up being okay, I think, after fighting it for like the first year, that there was a way to kind of bridge those worlds. And ultimately, my internship at the Women's Refugee Commission actually wound up kind of providing the path for me to get a really good job straight out of school. And so I really urge everyone to use their internships. I think they're really critical to your next step after school. And so I worked at the Women's Refugee Commission for about 1.5 years, and I was a communications officer there. And it's a very small organization. It's part of the International Rescue Committee. And it's a very small communications department. There are just 2 of us, myself and the director. And really it just wound up being a strategy position where even though it's a research and advocacy, well, it is a research and advocacy organization, right? So we're actually not on the ground doing program work. So it presented a special kind of communications challenge because you're not selling issues on the ground, you're selling research and advocacy. So you're a little bit more removed from the work. And again, I think when I was in school, it was like, I'm going to come out and I'm going to work on the ground, and you have all these, ideas of where you're going to go, and then you wind up somewhere else. So it's kind of shifting and recognizing what there is to learn and where you are. So it was a really actually fantastic opportunity working there for a year and a half because it was so small. I was able to kind of take on a lot and have the freedom and flexibility to make the job what I wanted it to be. So that involved everything from media outreach to website, development and content, to working closely with fundraising, coordinating with development to do strategy for fundraising, and writing a lot. And we developed a blog and launched a blog, and just really thinking about using different kind of communications tools to reach certain organizational goals. So that kind of that was really instrumental, I think, to my next position, which now I'm at the American Civil Liberties Union. And again, I thought, well, I'm never going to wind up doing domestic human rights work. I went to school for international affairs, like that's where I'm going to be. And at the Women's Refugee Commission, I started working more on immigrants' rights issues, and specifically immigration detention in the US, and just completely, fell in love with the issue, really became very committed to the issue. And so this opportunity came up at the ACLU, and it's a media position, and what that means is it's a little more traditional in terms of print and web, and you're placing, you're trying to disseminate the ACLU message. And the issues that I work on are immigrants' rights and racial justice, and it's interesting in this position because you're actually the gateway, you're the gatekeeper, you are responsible for creating the messaging for the organization, and the organization is vast. We're in every state, and we have our fingers on, a number of really critical issues. And as it turns out, both domestic and international human rights issues. So being responsible for cultivating a message that resonates with the American public primarily, but beyond as well, is actually a really fascinating process, and it's also, very strategic. And so, that's essentially what I'm doing, is I help develop messaging at the ACLU for our key issues, and then try and get them spread as wide and far as possible. So,
all right, that was really good. I'm jealous of Elizabeth's career. After my undergraduate degree, I was fairly sure that I wanted to go back to school to get my PhD to be a history professor. But I didn't want to go right back into school because 4 years seemed like enough to do in a row. And so I started looking for a job, doing something that involved research, and I got it in my head that wouldn't it be really cool to work for the Smithsonian system at a museum down in Washington, D.C., and I figured out how hard it is to get those jobs without an advanced degree, and so I ended up working for a consulting firm that's sort of like historians for hire, doing a lot of work on class action suits or environmental claims. And so I got to do some really interesting travel around the country, going to old nuclear weapons facilities and to Native American reservations to research sort of land rights and water rights and mining interests. And that part was really interesting, except for that the side I was always working on, who could afford to hire the consultants, were the companies that were polluting or disenfranchising people. And so, on top of that, I'm also always been a news junkie. I read several newspapers a day. I'm always talking about current events. I was always emailing friends and family articles that I thought were interesting with little commentary. And people, especially around the 2004 election, people said, Nat, this is great that you're always spamming us with these articles that you think are cool, but there's something called a blog where you can write what you want there and we'll visit it when we want to without you bugging us. And I was like, oh, that's a good idea. And so I started to get more and more interested in kind of American foreign policy, and so I started looking for jobs with NGOs and advocacy organizations. And I was living in DC, so there were a lot to choose from, and it was a total kind of career shift for me. I had no kind of experience, either as an undergraduate in classes or internships or anything, and so I was striking out a lot. But I think what really got me my interview with the Open Society Institute is my blog. It kind of demonstrated that I was engaging with these issues and really involved and sort of actively thinking about these things in my own time when no one's paying me to do it because I'm a news junkie and a dork and do it anyway. And so I think that actually helped me get my foot in the door. And so I started working for the Open Society Institute with the Middle East and Africa programs in the Washington, DC office, which is the kind of advocacy side of the organization. We're now the Open Society Foundation, so that's how I should be referring to it, I guess. And we're a grant-making foundation founded by George Soros, the financier. And we have several kind of core offices in the US and in Europe, and then about 35 affiliated foundations located around the world that do their own grant-making kind of locally in those communities. And so the Washington, D.C. office is tasked with kind of advocating on issues that are important to the foundation or to our grantees, bringing grantees through to meet with policymakers around the Hill. And so that's what I was doing. I was sort of like a Washington, D.C. tour guide for our grantees coming through. I'd take them to the Hill, to the State Department, to meet with officials. I attend a lot of events, kind of put together things for the newsletter. But then, since it's a nonprofit, I was also doing a lot of administrative work, kind of working with the more senior people. I think you'll find with nonprofits, a lot of times there's senior staff and junior staff. There's not a lot of kind of in-between. So if you're junior staff, you're going to be doing some really cool things, and then you'll also be submitting your boss's expense reports and making travel arrangements. And so after doing that for a couple of years, I said, I want to go back to school, get my degree, and then other people can make my travel arrangements. Still waiting for that to happen. But so when I decided that I wanted to come up to New York, so my wife and I are both from New York originally, and we knew we always wanted to make it back here. The New School seemed like a good fit, and I also liked how the New School's focus is really on practitioners in the kind of development, human rights, international affairs field, whereas a lot of other programs, I think their program is more like a stepping stone to get your PhD and move on. So I like that it was really kind of a master's level focus, which really appealed to me. And so one of the people who I worked with in the New York office frequently, when they heard I was coming up to New York, asked if I wanted to continue working part-time for the Knowledge Management Initiative, which is a kind of fancy word for internal communications. The Open Society Foundations is about 2,000 people worldwide, 40 or 50 different offices, and we do a really good job of sharing externally all the good work that we're doing, but we don't really do a good job sharing internally all the work that's been being done and connecting experts with each other within the organization. And so there's been a big shift at OSF over the last couple of years where that kind of role of knowledge management, as it's called, has really grown in importance. And so I've helped them develop sort of an internal Facebook for OSF, which we call Carl, after Karl Popper, who's the Open Society theorist and was one of George Soros's mentors at the London School of Economics. And so I develop content for the website, go around and train people how to use it, brainstorm with them, how to use kind of Web 2.0 tools like Carl, but also like Facebook and Twitter, figure out what do we share externally, what do we make sure is kind of only secure and accessible by our network of grantees and other employees for the Open Society foundations. And so once I graduated with my master's, I just started doing that full time, which is sort of a new position, which has been exciting because there's no expectations of what people should do in my role because I'm the first one to do it. So it's been really cool to go out to our foundations around the world and kind of sit down and hold seminars with them, talk to people about the work they're doing, figure out what their barriers are, and figure out if there's ways that we can kind of use technology to make our network feel closer and make kind of people out in the foundations or in New York or Washington, D.C. or Budapest feel like they're more in touch with our grantees and our field staff out at the foundation level. And so it's been really interesting, but also sort of a different focus than I expected to have. I'm very internally facing now, whereas I sort of pictured myself going back to doing advocacy work or kind of working more directly with grantees. Now I get sort of weekly tours of all the work that OSF is doing around the network, and so it's been really interesting, and it's also kind of gotten me involved in a lot of the sort of organizational wide issues that everyone always says that they should do, but no one ever wants to kind of be the point person for it. And so my small team is 3 people, and so we end up taking on things like redesigning the email distribution list systems across the foundations because we are kind of constantly in touch with all the programs, so we have a good idea of what the needs are and how the current systems aren't fitting those needs. Or being involved in designing like monitoring and evaluation systems, where traditionally we haven't been that excited about monitoring and evaluation because we want to spend our time and money trying to improve the world around us, not trying to figure out whether we've hit sort of nebulous goals, like is a society more open as the result of this grant? It's hard to say, but it's been interesting to kind of travel around and get everyone's thoughts on those, and that's sort of an ongoing project. And so yeah, it's much different than I ever expected. I didn't think that I would be managing a software project and working with developers and meeting with users and then translating user expectations into tools on a website. But at the same time, I think that's probably a skill that's going to become increasingly in demand. Because like I was saying before, there's not a lot of staff in nonprofits usually. If you're a junior person who can also do a little bit of web development or understand how to use a content management system for a website, that makes you more appealing than someone who can't, probably, because there's going to be a lot of kind of dual roles, I think, moving forward. So who knows, maybe I'll end up moving back to the program side eventually. I really like working at OSF, so I definitely see myself staying there. But I like the freedom that I have in my role right now and kind of figuring it out as I go. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Hi. So when I set off for college and undergrad, I either wanted to work for a record label or for ESPN. I was interested in sports, music, and communications. And the more you look at something underneath a microscope, the less usually appealing it tends to get. So I took classes in media and broadcast journalism and things like that, and realized it wasn't for me. I realized I was in Washington, D.C., George Washington University, and that they had a good international affairs program. So kind of at the very last minute, changed majors and got a great internship working in like public relations and communications for a public interest group in Washington, D.C., and developed an interest in urban development and refugee assistance. And after I graduated, I went to Argentina just on my own, found myself an internship working at an urban refugee center in Buenos Aires. At the time, believe it or not, there was actually a lot of refugees coming to Argentina from Africa. So they needed someone who spoke both English and French to work their refugee cases. So that was a really great experience for me, and I said, you know, I could see myself doing this kind of work. I got back to New York, where I'm from, and I spent a little time interning at the IRC as well, International Rescue Committee. But it was hard to get a job right out of college with only just a little internship experience. So I temped my way through the next 6 months and got into the new school. And at the new school, I was able to travel back to Argentina to do field research, and I was able to go to Brazil to do an internship working with the state government in Rio de Janeiro. All of this as a result of networking and just making contacts and learning Portuguese. And I also applied to the United Nations internship program, which is something where like 20,000 students or people apply every semester and 200 people get in. I was like, I have no shot getting this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I actually got it. I was amazed. And I had an internship working with UN Habitat here in New York, and it wasn't the greatest internship in terms of what I was able to contribute to the organization, but as far as the networking opportunity is concerned, it was second to none. So that's what I was doing pretty much every day. When I wasn't working, going to events, going to conferences, going to happy hours, meeting everybody that I could, and said to myself, this is going to come in handy one day. And it was fun too, so. Anyway, graduated from GPIA. When we graduated, I think we all graduated in May 2009. It was a really difficult job market, to say the least, at the time, and my fellow panelists may have been luckier than I was. It took me quite a long time to land something. I had a whole bunch of interviews. I came really close several times and didn't quite make it because I was competing with people who had, you know, PhDs, 10 years of experience, and they're looking for entry-level positions too. So it was difficult. I applied to this one other job here in New York, and one of the guys who looked at it said, because there's a sad reality to a lot of the jobs you'll see posted online. They're advertised online for transparency purposes a lot of the time. A lot of the time they have someone in mind already for that job, and you know, you might work for 3 hours on your application, but unless you unless you try something special, or you get lucky, which is possible. I've gotten lucky before. Nice to have it again. Your application might not even get read. So this person saw my application and said, well, you know, Mark, this job you applied for, you're completely overqualified for it, but we already gave it to somebody else. But your background would be perfect for this other gig with our organization in Port-au-Prince, working for the International Organization for Migration. Would you like to go to Haiti? It would just be 3 months to start out. And I said, sure, let's do it. So I worked for 6 months for the International Organization for Migration in Port-au-Prince for the shelter unit of the organization. IOM, for those of you who don't know, has been around since post-World War II, resettling World War II refugees, and traditionally they're more of a intergovernmental organization. At that works with like migration management, border management, reintegrating and resettling people who have been displaced by conflict or natural disaster. But more and more they're taking up kind of humanitarian aid, relief work. So that's what I was doing. After the earthquake, 2010, there were 1.3 million IDPs in the streets of Port-au-Prince, and the idea was to get all these people home. So we were either building transitional shelters for them, which is an electrical connection and a toilet away from a decent house, and removing rubble from earthquake wreckage to clear land for reconstruction. And that's the project that I was coordinating down there. It was a fantastic experience. It was really tough. It was really exhausting. I had to figure out how to work with, in French, with engineers, community mobilizers, logisticians, lawyers, local government, community leaders to clean up the mess down there. And but by the end of it, we got some really good results, and it was a good experience because, you know, you could actually see the results of your work right in front of you and actually help people. It says that I'm the field coordinator. I actually, a couple weeks ago, got back. I'm no longer working there because it's the work that they're doing down there is very projectized. And the nature of IOM's mission there is shifting from a emergency mission right after the quake to a early recovery stage. So I might go back in a few months, but in the meantime I'm applying to other things, and I came back from there much better shape than when I left, and I like to think that I left the neighborhood that I was working in better shape as well. So what does this all have to do with human rights? To me, having a roof over your head or to be able to benefit from urban life is, you know, human rights that I've been fortunate enough to be blessed with since day one. So so there. I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I guess I should start by saying that unlike sort of everybody else on the panel, I kind of knew what I wanted to do from the very beginning. My family is originally from Rwanda. I've actually only been in the States since I was 6, which is actually a long time. And my father was a diplomat. So growing up, you know, we lived in different places. I'd sort of gone, you know, lived in different countries. I was born in Belgium. We lived in Japan. You know, I went to a French international school. So I was sort of always equipped with this worldview, and I wanted to be my dad, basically, when I grew up. And so, you know, I went to college, got a BA in International Relations. I studied abroad when I was there. And then after college, I got a Rotary scholarship to go to South Africa for a year, which, by the way, I highly recommend. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity. You know, it's a year's worth of funding to go study anywhere that there are Rotary clubs, basically, which is almost everywhere in the world, surprisingly. And you have a lot of sort of freedom and independence to do what you want with that year. While I was there, I got a master's in gender studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. Because it was all, I mean, gender, sort of women's issues was always something I was interested in. And I had, I mean, it was a great opportunity to do it there, and to live in South Africa and sort of get that perspective. After that was over, I came back to DC, which is where I had grown up, thinking I was sort of set. You know, I had a BA, I had an MA from a university in Africa, I'd find a job, you know, real easily. That was not the case. And so, like Mark, I temped for a while, although I was lucky in that I sort of ended up temping at the U.S. African Development Foundation. And I was there for about 10 months. And that was a great opportunity in a lot of ways, mostly because it sort of exposed me to grant making, international grant making. The US ADF basically sort of provides small economic development grants to various groups around Africa, sort of local businesses, local NGOs. And what I was doing there was sort of supporting the grants program. And it was really useful in a lot of ways, mostly because I was doing a lot of writing. And something that I think is sort of extremely useful in this field is sort of knowing how to write. Knowing how to write grants, knowing how to write for different audiences. In that case, I was writing for the US government, basically. I think that came in really handy in the position that I got after that, which sort of actually circled back to my interest in women's issues, but more sort of on domestic policy level. So I moved on to the National Women's Law Center, which is another organization based in DC that sort of works on sort of an advocacy organization for women's and children's rights in the United States. And there I was sort of doing communications and advocacy work, outreach work to all of sort of the subscribers that the NWLC had. While I was there, we also started a blog, and so I was sort of keeping up with writing, which was great, but I was sort of not quite in sort of the area that I wanted to be working in, which was sort of domestic policy issues. And so after about a couple years of that, I decided I wanted to go back to grad school because I sort of wanted to refocus my agenda toward sort of international issues. And, like Elizabeth, I only applied to the new school. I figured this was the only place where I could sort of do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I had a lot of questions I wanted to answer, a lot of things I wanted to explore, and I felt like this was a place that would allow for that kind of flexibility and sort of think differently. In DC, there's a tremendous amount of, programs, MA programs, international relations. I didn't want to go to any of them because they're sort of very, in my opinion anyway, sort of very traditional. DC is a very traditional town that way. And so, I think a part of it was also wanting to get out of DC after having been there for a few years. So I came to New York, did a couple years here. It was a great experience. In between the 2 years, I actually did the IFP with the IRC in Nairobi. Nat and I both got that IFP, and we lived together in Nairobi, actually. And I think that also helped tremendously sort of afterwards. I was working for their Somalia program, which was based in Nairobi, but I had the opportunity to go to Somaliland, which is not something many people get to do. You can't, it's not a place people go to every day. So that was tremendous. And I think one of the reasons I picked GPIA also was that there was this IFP option. When looking at other schools, I didn't see that sort of international work experience offered. And GPIA was one of the few schools that did that, which was really, really helpful. And so, yes, sort of, GPIA ends May of '09. Like Mark, again, it's sort of like, I think I'm in a great position. I've done all these great things. I've lived abroad. I know how to write. And you sort of think things are going to fall into your lap, and they don't. I applied for maybe 50 or 60 different jobs, sort of, everyday idealist, Foreign Policy Association. All of these different listservs. During the day, and then I would just go out because I was in New York. And out of those, I think I literally did get one interview, and that was at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is where I am now. The position I applied for there was a research associate position. And I should say the NED, that's what we call ourselves, is sort of mostly a grant-making organization, similar to OSF, in that the biggest part of the NED just sort of gives small grants to civil society organizations around the world, sort of working on various issues from civic education to human rights, sort of women's rights, media, freedom of information, that kind of thing. But there are also other parts of the NED, one of which is something we call the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which has a Democracy Fellows program, which brings sort of activists, journalists, academics from around the world for a 5-month sort of residence at NED. And so NED then hires sort of research associates to work with the fellows during their time at NED. And so that's what I did my first year there. It was a great opportunity. I worked with people from Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Turkmenistan, sort of helping them with their research, and all of them have incredible stories that, sort of some of us can only imagine. But in a lot of ways, it was also not something that challenged me as much as I thought I would be challenged, which is fine, but it was also sort of a great way for me to get established at the NED. While there, I sort of got to know the folks in the Africa program pretty well. I sort of, hinted that I was interested in sort of working with them and sort of seeing what they were doing. And so, as my RA-ship was ending, one of the people on the program was leaving. And she sort of very plainly was said, you know, you should apply for my position. I'm leaving in a month. I'm like, that's great. My job ends in a month. And so I did. This is what I'm doing now. I mean, I think what Mark said is quite true about sort of these positions that get advertised, even though organizations already have somebody in mind. I mean, I think that's what happened in my case. You know, I sort of be very blunt in saying that, you know, other people applied, but sort of I think they had me in mind the whole time. And so what I'm doing now is I'm an assistant program officer, which is sort of a junior program officer position for Sudan, which is our second biggest program in the Africa program after the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what I do, I mean, sort of varies from day to day, but basically I sort of manage a portfolio of 30 grants that we give that are sort of, you know, split both between North and South Sudan. And that involves on a day-to-day basis just sort of monitoring, evaluation, you know, keeping in touch with grantees. And I should say, I mean, the one thing about NED is we don't have any field offices. Everything is based in DC. And so, I mean, I think that's sort of a bonus and a minus in that it sort of makes our program officers' jobs harder in terms of monitoring the grants and the, you know, sort of the projects and how things are going. But I mean, I also like that a lot of, I mean, it's just also sort of in my view that we sort of have a lot of faith in our grantees. I mean, we only, for the most part, give grants to local organizations, so we don't give grants to international organizations. And so, like I said, part of my job is sort of monitoring that. A lot of it is also, I mean, I also do a tremendous amount of writing at work still. You know, every time we have a board meeting, I have to put together a country background for Sudan. All the program officers, you know, have to for the countries they work on. We have to sort of, you know, I get proposals from all over the country, you know, that I sort of, I mean, I review proposals, I decide which ones to fund, that kind of thing. And I also travel to Sudan twice a year, which is another fantastic part of my job, but which I should say it's also really exhausting. I mean, I think there's this tendency to think that sort of travel is fantastic, which it is, but it's also really, really exhausting. And it takes a toll, especially for people who have sort of families, children, if you're in a relationship, that kind of thing too. So I think that's always something to think about when you're thinking about this kind of work, that it might take you away for a long time or for long periods of time. But other than that, I mean, I also do, you know, I do a lot of reading for work, which is exciting for me. You know, I mean, I'm always in contact with other funders, with the, you know, sort of State Department aid, those kind of things, sort of coordinate what other people are doing in terms of Sudan. I mean, I think one of the best parts of my job is that I get to strategize in terms of what priorities should be for NED or what priorities, you know, should be in Sudan, that kind of thing. So it comes with a lot of responsibility, and I like it also because it's sort of, because I like, you know, I always thought I was going to get a PhD, although I don't think that's going to happen anymore, but I like the fact that I get to read and to write for work and strategize. I sort of still think that way. There's a lot of thinking that goes on at NED, which is great for me because that's sort of the kind of person that I am anyway. And so I think I get the best of both worlds in terms of sort of development and, you know, academics, I guess, if you call that, or, you know, the scholarly angle of things. So that's good. I mean, I think that's maybe all I've got to say.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful introductions. I have to say, every time I listen to our students, either when they arrive here or after they leave and they come tell me, I feel jealous because I feel like I'm doing such boring work. So with that being said, let me remind you that you have little cue cards that you can write your questions on, and someone is going to collect them for us. And so you can, Stefan, pass them along up the front. In the meantime, while you're doing that, let me kick off the question and answer period with the following observation and question to you. I noted as you were telling us about your both prior to GPI experiences as well as after the fact, that all of you had already a set of skills, interests, abilities, whether in media or in networks and blogs or in languages and exposure to other countries, already interacting on some level with things you have continued doing. So I guess the obvious question is, this is kind of broadly speaking, what does education at GPIA add to that? Right? What's the value added in both practical terms, maybe in terms of kind of skills and specific classes that you might have taken, and especially given the kind of jobs you're doing now, So you got a degree. Is it simply on a paper you can say, I got a degree, and maybe that's enough, right? As Nat said, you might not even get the foot in the door if you don't have the degree, right, for some jobs. Or is there actually something more? Do you get more than perhaps that basic expectation of getting a master's degree? So if you could comment on that while we wait for. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can say something, part of why I came to GPIA, or the new school, was that I sort of had these general large questions about aid and development, and sort of, because I was interested in doing that kind of work in Africa, but I also had sort of a lot of reservations about the way that work is carried out. And I mean, that's the kind of work that I got to do at GPIA, and I mean, that's why I came to GPIA, and I think that's a lot of that influences how I do my own job. Because I am in aid, I am in development. I'm given all this money to sort of spend in a country, and I have to think about how I'm spending that country, and how I'm spending it in that country. And I think one of the things we sort of need to be always thinking about is that, I mean, we're sort of not always doing good. Like you might fail, you might give this grant, or you might spend this money unwisely. Like the idea that, sort of always have to be thinking about the way you're doing your job. And I think that's what I bring to my job, thanks sort of the work that I did here, the discussions I had here, the sort of, the reading I did here, the papers I did here, that, we have to look at our roles in very critical ways. And I think that's extremely important in this kind of work, especially.
I would agree completely with what Sonia just said. The new school gives a lot of importance to critical thinking, and try to predict the unintended consequences of the work that you do. So classes that helped a lot were sort of like the skills-based classes that taught you like practical things that you use in your job every day, like program management, or believe it or not, research methods. Now, I think another big part of what GPIA helps you out with is just your fellow classmates and your professors outside of class. Getting to know them and find out like their trajectories, where they've been, what they're interested in. I learned so much I learned probably just as much from my classmates and professors outside of class as I did in class. The fact that you can take, well, I don't know if you still can, take language classes for free if you're in the program. I managed to learn Portuguese while I was in the new school, and I can work in it now. So that was big, because languages, if you're trying to work in another country, if you have that skill better than the next guy, you will be considered more favorably. And finally, the IFP, in terms of what I just did in Haiti, getting to work in slums and in difficult conditions on the outskirts of Buenos Aires and in favelas in Rio de Janeiro, really prepared me well, psychologically and professionally, for what I saw in Haiti. The scale is obviously completely different, but fundamentally, a lot of the challenges and the issues are the same. So, yeah, I'd agree with Sonia.
I'll add to that. I think also New School has a lot of emphasis on group work in a lot of the classes, and you cannot work at a nonprofit and not work well with a team and be comfortable leading a team or working in a team, collaborating with others. That's how 98% of projects get done. So I think having that integrated into our graduate studies was definitely helpful. You hear people say all the time, like, oh, I just want to write a paper, I hate working as a group. That may be true, but then you're never going to work in a nonprofit or NGO, or because everything is done in teams or in working groups, and being able to kind of work in a group, synthesize what's going on, repeat that back to other people who weren't in that meeting becomes really important. And I think a lot of the classes at the New School did a pretty good job preparing me for that. And I was going to add something else, but I forget what it was.
No, I mean, I think I just really relied on the program to introduce me not only just to a whole new, new issues for me that I hadn't studied really in depth. I studied art history and Spanish in undergrad, and language was really important to me. I'm fluent in Spanish, and I came into the program understanding that they really emphasized and valued the role of language and field work. And for me, those two things were really a priority. And the fact that there is such a flexibility and creativity in the way that you're educated here, or that you participate in your education here. And that was fundamental for my experience. And that's why I only applied to this program, because I just knew, looking at other programs, that you wouldn't have that kind of experience.
Thank you. And maybe to hone in a little bit more on things you already mentioned, just to get a fuller answer. Obviously, IFP is important. We make sure that it's known that IFP is an important part of the degree. So is the option for practicum and thesis, right? And students often have, quite rightly so, kind of worries as to, well, why choose one over the other? And I can't remember exactly what trajectory each one of you chose in terms of thesis or practicum. Perhaps if you can speak both to why you chose one or the other and how you foresaw that, to the extent that you could, as applicable, and whether those experiences, either in IFP or in a practicum or writing a thesis, were actually something that your employers have picked up on, or that you could sort of advertise and say, look, I've done this, and this is a particular experience that I have that others don't. So maybe more concretely to those particular aspects of the program.
Well, I did the practicum, and no, and I specifically did it because I wanted to kind of have this kind of mock work experience. And I was sort of lucky because I was also working while I was in my program, so I was sort of had my foot in the door in an organization and was able to kind of do both. But I definitely wanted to sort of mimic a project management experience as much as possible. And though I didn't necessarily like the project management course that you took before the PIA and the sort of learning the discourse of monitoring and evaluation and kind of the UN system for submitting proposals, it was actually ended up being really helpful because now I'm involved in this giant project of designing monitoring and evaluation kind of tools for OSF. So if I didn't have the PDPM course to kind of learn the UN system, then I wouldn't know what to avoid when I'm designing the OSF model. So that was really good, just kind of as a specific skill that I was glad I picked up on.
I also did the practicum mainly because I was sick of writing papers. No, I got a lot out of all the papers that I had written before. I took advantage of each paper opportunity to write about something that I was interested in and then I wanted to get in to know about more in depth. So by the time it was time to choose, it was obvious to me. And working with a client organization was a really interesting and challenging process. PDPM did help a lot in terms of making us prepared for that option. I would say that because we had to go back and forth with the organization on a weekly basis, and they were very fickle in what they were looking for, and I think it gave us a good background in terms of people change their minds all the time. They're not really sure what they want, so you have to kind of help guide them in the right direction. And like Sonia said, being able to write both a convincing email, a succinct abstract, and a good proposal goes a long way, because you can be the most charming person face to face, you can speak 6 languages, but if you can't write a good whatever kind of document they're looking for, they might not be interested in you. So, yeah. So there.
I actually wrote a thesis because I like to write, and I, felt like I had all these things that I had sort of studied and learned, and I wanted to sort of distill them into this one big document. And I think it goes, I think you can go either way. I think Mark is right. Knowing how to write is tremendously important. I can attest to the fact that if you can put together a good proposal, it goes a long way for those that sort of work. Because it's interesting for me to sort of, I'm a funder, and so I'm not the one sort of seeking funding. And so I see the kinds of things that come in the ways in which people write, and I think, writing is tremendously important. Just, like he said, emails too. It's like, this morning I had to spend a good amount of time trying to figure out how to word an email to a grantee whose latest proposal I just rejected, just sort of, keep them interested still or keep the door open, but saying, sorry, we couldn't fund you this time. Those kinds of things. It seems really sort of irrelevant, but it's actually very important. And yeah, I think I can't stress enough how important it is to sort of write, or to know how to write. So if you just like Nat was saying, if you have a blog, or something like that, or if you do that kind of writing too, I think it's tremendously important, because that kind of skill comes in very handy, and I think that's something my boss tells us all the time. And I think maybe it sort of might be unique for my organization, because we do a lot of writing, for the board, for the U.S. government, for whatever, but I think that happens in any organization. And I also sort of second what Nat said about working within groups. You also have to be prepared to be in a lot of meetings all the time at various levels. And it might be that everybody just sort of sits there on their BlackBerries, but you still have to, meet with people a lot. And so knowing how to sort of, just sort of like those kind of interpersonal, relationships are really sort of how to manage different people differently is really important.
I think that's everything. I did the practicum too, because I really saw the thesis as more of taking a direction toward maybe a PhD, or continuing with academia. And my practicum experience was frustrating, but I do think that it was actually valuable, and a good indicator of how nonprofits run, actually, and their dysfunction. So I think that in itself was like very instructive.
Well, let me ask you the flip side of that. What skills or knowledge, either very specific or more general, do you feel you didn't get and you wish you had? Or what skills have you now found out would have been really, really useful to hone while you are here? Be as specific as you wish, or as general as you find appropriate.
I just want to say something about the PDPM class, because I actually think that it could be really, I think I don't know how it exists now, but in my class I felt like it was lacking. Like, we needed stronger sort of structure and organization, because now that at the Women's Refugee Commission, working on a project cycle, you really get a sense of what that means. You're working with it every day, you're applying it. And there were little remnants in my mind thinking, oh, I vaguely remember, this being mentioned in PDPM, and it was directly relevant. And I just felt that class could have been more concrete in its examples and of how to follow through a project cycle, which is directly relevant to doing program work and really critical to doing it well and feeling prepared for moving into that field.
I think the hard part about having sort of practice-focused coursework in general is that presents sort of the ideal scenario, which is never how things actually play out in reality. So for example, the way you learn how to do monitoring and evaluation, it's sort of how to demonstrate the success of your program, and sort of, so you're trying to spin everything to kind of fit into this very strict rubric. And in reality, though, you're going to learn a lot more from your failures than you are your successes in many ways. And so when I'm designing this program, that's sort of what I'm focusing on, is to get people to talk more actively about times that they didn't succeed, and to share that information, to get feedback from other people running similar programming or doing similar work in some of our other foundations. And so to me, that's sort of the whole in the program, is it's like, does anyone really do all of those aspects of the work? But at the same time, you probably at least need to know what's expected in certain organizations. So I think it's a tough line. I don't know how you kind of avoid that problem.
One good thing that's happened since I left the new school is that Milano and GPIA are now together. I regret not having taken advantage more of Milano courses, because when I was, since then, it's like, man, I wish I would have taken that quantitative methods class or the urban data analysis class, or, there were a couple classes that I took at the new school where I was in the class the first time it was being offered. We were the guinea pigs, and they didn't turn out as great as I would have liked. And I would have liked to have spent that time maybe taking some classes in Milano. But you guys seem like you're all set now. In terms of the IFP, while I think it's great and everybody should do it, I don't know if progress has been made since I was a student again, but there was a kind of a unpleasant surprise when I got to where I did my IFP, and finding out that what I was planning on doing when I was there was no longer possible. So I kind of had to, think of something to do as an alternative on the fly, and it was hard. We made the best of a situation, but we lost 2 precious weeks, like a quarter of the IFP. So some of the coordinators are probably better than others, but concrete objectives laid out at the beginning of the IFP would have been nicer. And of course, when you're traveling, Murphy's Law comes into effect all the time, and you never know what's going to happen. But there, I'm going to stop complaining.
Just to add to that very quickly, I did the thesis, I didn't do the PIA or the PDPM. This might sound silly, but frankly, I think, if you can use Microsoft Office, then you're set. Like, if you can put together a good PowerPoint, if you know how to use Excel, if you know how to navigate those things. It is actually really important.
So if you remember, or if you haven't erased that part of your memory, how long approximately did it take you till you felt, okay, or getting the first interview, for example, right? And then getting actually the acceptance?
I think that I was just really lucky, so I don't know if I should, I graduated at the end of May, and I went to France for a language immersion program for 10 weeks, and within 2 weeks of being back, I had a job offer from the Women's Refugee Commission, and I hadn't applied for a job. It was unsolicited. It was just, and
you won the lottery.
Yeah, and I won the lottery. Right. But it's because I had the internship there, and then a position had come open, and they had me in mind to fill the position. And again, they had gone ahead and published it, but with it already in mind, they wanted me to fill it. So it was just very lucky. And actually, the whole summer, though, I had spent from France, now stupidly wasting so much time and not enjoying France, but I was applying for jobs and stressing out so much. And just the same thing, just sending resume after resume out to OSI and like wherever, and it was just nothing. And I was totally overqualified, and just not even one response, like nothing. So, and then I wind up getting a job through a connection, so it's frustrating.
I was sort of lucky because I was working while I was in school, and so I was keeping my foot in the door in an organization that I knew that I wanted to continue working at. I wasn't positive that it would end up turning into a full-time position, but luckily it did. So I just sort of transitioned right away into my current role when I graduated. So, but when I was initially looking for a job, kind of shifting from the consulting work that I was doing and going over to an NGO, I probably was searching for like 6 months before before I got my first couple of interviews. But then once I got one interview, it was really weird. I got like 5 interviews, and then so it seemed like something was in the air for whatever reason. But again, I was probably not the strongest candidate at that time, since I didn't have any formal experience in the kind of NGO advocacy sector yet. So coming out of graduate school, hopefully that makes you a more appealing candidate. But unfortunately, I can just say at OSF, internal kind of lateral movement happens before outside people get brought in, and they advertise it just to advertise it. So it's hard to tell. All I can say is put the lines in the water and demonstrate that you're going to be doing this type of work regardless of whether you get hired or not. So sort of show how in your own time you're doing a lot of reading or doing work or doing volunteer activities because you're passionate about it, not just because it happens to be the job that you're applying for. And I think that can kind of help set you apart, but it's tough.
Like Elizabeth, I took a little time off after graduated, just kind of chilled out for a month and a half because I had a really grueling last semester. It was a full-time internship and lots of classes and PIA. And so after that, it took me about 5 months before I started getting interviews. And exactly like Nat, I got 4 of them all at the same time. Like with a span of 2 weeks, I heard back. And the first one, you're really pumped. Second one, you get like this boost of confidence. Third one, you're like, oh man. And the fourth, you're like, well, how am I gonna make this decision, And it turns out I didn't get any of them. So then another couple months went by, and I guess in total it took like 10, 11 months out of school before I went to Haiti. Was there another part to the question?
No, that'll
do. Sorry.
If there was, I've forgotten that already.
That was a rough trip down memory lane.
I think my story is a bit similar to Liz's. I started applying fairly late, like in May, because I was writing a thesis. I had 2 classes. I just sort of didn't have the time, which I'm sure you can all understand. And then I just sort of applied nonstop through July, and then got the 1 interview, and that's all that I got. So I took the job because I didn't really have time to sort of wait around for something else to come. I wish I'd had this spectrum of rolling interviews, but that didn't happen for me either. And I think you sort of have to be prepared to, apply below your sort of skill set and be prepared to sort of do something you might not necessarily want to do. I think at least at NEB too, there are, people with masters who are program assistants. But then, sort of, as at sort of OSF, people get to move up. And so it's sort of, I think getting your foot in the door is always sort of the ultimate goal. And then sort of maneuvering your way once you're there. But yeah, I think, I have friends from the new school who still sort of haven't found work, and, we're almost 2 years out. So it's, there's never a real formula for this. And especially in this field, I live in DC, where there are a tremendous amount of people looking for work in international affairs. And if you can, and sort of the advice is always to take an internship or to do this, and I couldn't afford to take an unpaid internship, and those kinds of things. But so, you just sort of have to, and I just kept applying, and it gets to be really demoralizing, but somehow you end up here at some point, so yeah.
Well, a couple of you mentioned the sort of tricky aspect of trying to understand what's going on internally in the organization. They might have a candidate, right? Their description for a job might be quite loose and sort of doesn't really indicate what you're going to do. So how would you say, you personally, or perhaps a sort of 2020 perspective, how would you say students should go about selecting the job they're applying for? Do you just apply for everything across the board and hope that one hits? Or is there a certain level?
I applied to everything I could find, basically. Starting out, I think I'm in a better position now whenever I sort of decide to move on. But, right out of grad school, even though I thought I had all this great experience, it was just sort of, it was really tough, and I just sort of applied to everything and sort of waited to see what happened. Yeah.
I think if you can if you have even just one or two connections, you go to those people and you ask for 5 names from each of them and you start doing informational interviews. That has always worked better for me than this just blasting the resume out just randomly. I've never ever gotten a response from sending my resume out that way through Idealist, not one time. And so I literally, even now, and just with this new job that I've just recently moved into, I was making lists of contacts and calling up, doing informational interviews, and thinking, think of me, and do you know somebody else? And that's how I would find out also that this is a widespread phenomenon, this publishing of jobs, that it's a joke. So you want to just get in with people personally so that they're thinking of you, they have their resume in front of you, they can send it to their friend who they just heard this job opening. That's my advice.
Yeah, 3 words: networking, networking, and more networking. 2 of the interviews that I did end up getting were through personal contacts. So, with the assistance of personal contacts. So that goes a long way. I don't recommend burning bridges with people, no matter how much you hate their guts, because they might be able to help you and genuinely want to help you. So that's one mistake I did, and then I corrected that, and it helped me in the end. Thinking outside the box, really. I think it's good to find out what's out there on job search sites. I think it's good to look at the organization's websites and see what's listed, and if there's something that you could see yourself doing, apply for it. But you can't just rely on that, because I did get a couple responses from things like that, but because they're advertised, 10 times as many people see them and apply for them. And there was this one job I applied for in Geneva, and I knew someone who worked there, and I found out who the person was who got the job that I applied to. It was a P2 position at a UN organization, and the person who got the job was 10 years older than me, had 15 years of professional experience, PhD and a law degree. And how do you compete with that? There was another job I applied for, and I got an interview. I got really close. I was like, I nailed that interview. I'm gonna get it. I walked out of the room feeling really confident, and didn't get it. I knew someone in there. I was like, so who ended up getting that job, man? And they send emails internally to introduce the new coworkers. It's this beautiful Spanish woman who speaks 5 languages, again has a PhD, and is 5 years older than me. And it's tough out there, but real life experiences here. No, I think going to conferences, meeting people, carrying a business card, being able to talk about yourself in a positive way, not too arrogant way. And you heard about this thing called the elevator pitch. You meet someone in the lobby, you got to be able to tell them. It's a gimmicky phrase, but it's true, because people have short attention spans, and they don't have time for a lot of this stuff, because you and everybody else are after the same thing. So apply to those jobs that you see on the internet. Don't let the harsh realities discourage you from it, because when I was out of undergraduate, I did get a job that way. It's a different world now. A lot more people are online, but use your personal contacts as much as possible.
And just to sort of add to that also, I mean, I think I agree that it should be sort of a mix of both, but I think you do want to also sort of keep applying because you want to get into the habit of sort of writing cover letters, writing resumes, and sort of having to think about why certain jobs you would be good at or you'd be qualified for, because those are questions that come up in interviews. And sort of you want to sort of always keep, be thinking about those things. And so, I mean, I recommend just sort of for that purpose, keeping applying, keeping writing cover letters, those kinds of things, even though it gets really tedious. And two, on sort of informational interviews, I mean, I think they can be useful, but you also sort of want to make sure you're not wasting anybody's time. I mean, you have to sort of go in there with a set of questions, sort of knowing what you want to get out of it, so that you don't sort of show up and say, well, tell me about yourself. And I say that because I've actually sort of done a couple, for people in DC, which I thought was common because, only a year ago I had been in their position. And I didn't quite understand what they thought, what they would get out of me. But I mean, I think you sort of, you have to be, there's ways those can be useful, but you sort of have to be really, really strategic. And even sort of when you're getting in touch with people, just make sure to have sort of the right wording, that kind of thing, so that they don't just sort of ignore your email or your phone call. I mean, I think there's sort of not necessarily rules, but ways that you should think sort of harder. Those are sort of more challenging to pull off.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left in this particular part, so let me cap this question-answer session with following question. What are your plans for future? What strategies are you entertaining? What steps are you planning to take or imagine yourself taking in, let's say, next 5 years?
I live for the moment.
I think I can see myself transitioning back to sort of a more outwardly facing role. I really like working at OSF, so I hope to stay here as long as I can continue to kind of hop around the organization doing different things. I think it's good to wear a lot of hats if you're gonna either change jobs or stay at the same organization. I think it keeps things interesting to do different things. So my role that I'm doing right now, and it's like I'm officially in the IT department. I didn't expect to be doing that, and but it's actually really interesting, and I get to see a completely different side of an organization, sort of the inner workings, and kind of translate the frustrations between the administrative side and the program side. So after I've done this sort of administrative side, maybe I'll go back to the program side and hopefully be more effective as a program person because I know the kind of internal workings and the systems at the organization. And so hopefully that would make me more effective. But yeah, ultimately I think I'd like to have more interaction with our grantees and with kind of policymakers and have a little bit more public-facing role. But for now, I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm enjoying the travel, being able to go to the foundations.
I agree with what Elizabeth said earlier. We studied an international affairs program, so the idea is that we're going to be based somewhere else, that we're going to travel a lot for work. But one thing that I did, during my kind of free time, you can call it, is travel around the U.S. And you don't have to go very far. You don't have to go to the developing world to find developing world type problems. And the work that you're good at on an international level, while it's a little different, sure, prepares you pretty well for something that's based in the United States, whether it's local government or a nonprofit or consulting or the private sector. U.S. doesn't have the greatest job market, but it's getting better. And all you have to do is go to the Bronx or to Newark or to Long Island to find out that there's a lot of work to be done, and you might not. So that's one thing that I'm planning on doing. I'm not going to put all my chips on finding work Latin America, or like trying to find something at with the UN or something like that. I'm planning on looking a lot around my hometown and other cities too.
I mean, I think like Nat, I really like what I'm doing. And I, haven't actually been doing it for that long, so I see myself sort of remaining in this field. I sort of would like to expand more regionally. But I think to sort of add on to what Mark just said, I mean, there's this tendency to think that we sort of, you start somewhere, you get this degree, and then everything sort of happens in a straight line. But I think what sort of, our experiences demonstrates that, nobody goes in a straight line. Like, we've all done different things in different places, and it's sort of, you have to always be thinking that you could be somewhere else in a couple of years doing something completely different. And it's sort of, in the end, that might all sort of make sense. So, I mean, while I see myself staying sort of in this kind of work, not necessarily at NED, I think it's sort of, you can never quite know what's going to come next. But I think you pick things up wherever you go, and that helps you wherever you go after that.
Well, thank you for answering our questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to the more specific questions, but you will be able to do so in the speed networking, so you can ask a particular person the question you have. Let me introduce Carol Anderson, who is Director of Career Services, Development and Placement, and she will introduce you to the next task we have for you.
Thank you so much for facilitating. That was terrific. If any of you have not yet been exposed to career services, we teach the 90-second pitch, elevator speech. We teach you how to interview. We teach you how to prepare for informational interviews. We have some very intensive workshops, almost over for the semester. But we do have one more. The 7-hour job strategy workshop is next Friday, the 15th. We do that 4 times a semester. So if you've not been exposed to us, you're welcome to come in. And we serve as alumni for life as you go through your trajectory. But it was really interesting to have this mini reunion from the class of 2009. And wonderful to hear. The themes I heard were resilience and resourcefulness and tenacity and not giving up and trying every way possible. And it's a story I hear over and over again, especially in this job market. And thank you very much for sharing all that, your failures as well as your successes.